Sometimes the cruelest thing about the truth is how long it takes to walk through the right door. Rain hammered against the tall glass windows of Bellamy's Steakhouse, while the dinner crowd moved beneath chandeliers worth more than most people's cars. Silverware clinked softly. Expensive watches flashed beneath warm golden light. And in the middle of it all, Claire Bennett stood perfectly still beside table 12 as shattered coffee spread slowly across the marble floor near her shoes. Nobody spoke at first. The silence came before the judgment always did. Claire's breathing remained calm, even while dark coffee soaked the edge of her white apron. A man in a navy suit pushed his chair back sharply. "My watch was right here," he snapped, pointing toward the table. 30 seconds ago. His wife looked horrified as she searched beneath linen napkins and crystal glasses. "Oh my God, the Patek." Nearby conversations began to fade. Heads turned one by one. Claire lowered her eyes toward the broken cup beside her hand. "I'm sorry about the coffee, sir." "Forget the coffee," the man barked. "Where's my watch?" Gordon Pike appeared almost instantly, like he'd been waiting for disaster all evening. His polished shoes clicked sharply against the marble floor as he approached. "What seems to be the issue here?" The customer exhaled hard through his nose. "My watch disappeared." Gordon's eyes shifted immediately toward Claire. Not toward the guests. Not toward the floor. Toward her. "Claire," he said quietly, "you were serving this table?" "Yes." "And nobody else came near it?" Claire opened her mouth slightly, then stopped herself. Rain slid slowly down the restaurant windows behind her like melting glass. Somewhere in the corner, soft jazz continued playing as if none of this mattered. Gordon's jaw tightened. "Sir, I assure you we take this very seriously." The customer crossed his arms. "That watch cost more than your yearly salary." Claire heard a woman nearby whisper something under her breath. Another customer leaned sideways to watch more closely. It always happened fast. One accusation. Then the room decided who you were. Gordon forced a thin smile toward the guests. "Claire," he said softly, "why don't we step into the back for a moment?" Claire looked down at her trembling fingers. Not fear, just exhaustion. 12 hours into her shift, and her feet already ached beneath worn black shoes. But her voice stayed steady. "Of course." As she bent carefully to clean the broken coffee cup, Gordon suddenly spoke again. "Actually," his tone sharpened. "Empty your apron pockets first." The entire restaurant went quiet. Claire froze for half a second. Sebastian Reed looked up from his corner booth for the first time that evening. He had been sitting alone near the rain-streaked windows in a charcoal suit that fit too perfectly to be accidental. Most people in Manhattan recognized him instantly. Billionaire. Investor. Owner of Reed Holdings. But Sebastian said nothing. He simply watched. Claire slowly reached into her apron pocket. A lipstick tube. 2 folded receipts. A pen with cracked blue plastic. She placed them gently on the table beside the shattered coffee cup. Gordon's expression didn't change. "Your bag too." The humiliation arrived quietly. Not loud like anger. Heavy like cold rain. Claire bent down and lifted her worn leather purse onto the nearest chair. The zipper sounded impossibly loud in the silence. She emptied it piece by piece. Loose cash. Hand lotion. A small bottle of aspirin. And finally, a faded photograph that slipped onto the white tablecloth face up. A little blonde girl smiling beside a woman Claire no longer spoke to. Gordon glanced at the picture before looking away impatiently. "That all?" Claire nodded once. The customer stared hard at the empty chair. Disappointed, there was nothing there to confirm what he already wanted to believe. But the damage had already begun. Claire could feel it moving across the room in whispers and sideways glances. People trusted appearances. And tonight, she looked like someone easy to blame. Sebastian Reed leaned back slowly in his seat, eyes fixed on Claire, while thunder rolled softly outside. She never defended herself. Not once. And somehow, that unsettled him more than guilt would have. The rain outside grew heavier as Gordon Pike folded his arms across his chest and stared at Claire Bennett like patience itself had become expensive. The restaurant had returned to movement, but not to normal. Conversations resumed in whispers. Wine glasses clinked softer now. Every few seconds, another customer glanced toward Claire with the same expression people reserved for bad news on television. Curious. Distant. Already convinced. "Come with me," Gordon said quietly. Claire nodded once and followed him across the dining room, while wet footprints reflected beneath the chandelier light. Her apron still smelled faintly like coffee. Sebastian Reed watched her pass his table without lifting her eyes. Most people in trouble looked around desperately, searching for sympathy. Claire did not. She moved like someone already familiar with disappointment. Gordon pushed open the office door near the kitchen, and the noise of the restaurant faded behind them. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed softly above filing cabinets and security monitors. A small fan rattled near the ceiling. Claire stood near the door while Gordon loosened his tie with visible irritation. "You understand how serious this is, right?" Claire looked at the floor for a moment before answering. "Yes. That watch costs $320,000. I heard him." Gordon exhaled sharply. "Then help me understand why you are acting so calm." Claire finally lifted her eyes toward him. They looked tired more than afraid. Would panicking help? Gordon stared at her for a second, caught off guard by the question. Then his expression hardened again. "The guests are threatening police involvement." Claire said nothing. Gordon walked toward the desk and grabbed a printed incident form from a drawer. "Bellamy's has protocols for this kind of thing." He placed the paper in front of her. "If an employee accepts responsibility voluntarily, the situation stays private." Claire looked down at the form. The words blurred slightly beneath the buzzing office light. Admission of misconduct. Immediate termination. Possible financial liability. Her fingers tightened softly around the edge of the paper. "You want me to confess?" Gordon's tone became quieter, almost rehearsed. "I want this situation resolved before Reed Holdings signs a $50 million partnership in my dining room tonight." At the mention of Sebastian Reed, Claire glanced unconsciously toward the office window that overlooked the restaurant floor. Sebastian still sat alone near the rain-covered glass, one hand resting near an untouched whiskey. Even from a distance, he looked completely detached from the chaos around him. But his eyes remained fixed in her direction. Gordon noticed. "Do not expect anyone out there to save you." Claire almost smiled at that. Not because it was cruel, because it was familiar. 3 years earlier, she had stood inside another office with another manager demanding another confession for something she did not do. Back then, she had cried, explained, defended herself until her throat hurt. None of it mattered. Innocent people still lost jobs when powerful people needed someone convenient to blame. She learned that lesson the hard way. Gordon slid a pen across the desk. "Sign it, Claire." The pen rolled slowly to a stop beside her hand. Outside the office window, lightning flashed briefly across the Manhattan skyline. Claire stared at the paper while memories moved quietly behind her eyes. Hospital bills. 2 jobs. Endless night shifts. The landlord warning taped to her apartment door last winter. She could survive losing another job. What frightened her was losing herself trying to prove something nobody wanted to hear. Gordon softened his voice slightly. "Look, if you cooperate, maybe I can convince the owners not to press charges." Claire closed her eyes for one brief second. Then she picked up the pen. Out in the dining room, Sebastian Reed leaned forward slightly in his seat for the first time all evening. Something about the way Claire held that pen unsettled him deeply. Not guilt, not fear. It looked more like surrender from someone who had stopped expecting fairness a long time ago. The pen hovered above the paper while thunder rolled somewhere over the East River. Claire Bennett stared at the signature line without moving. The fluorescent lights above her buzzed softly, flickering once like they were tired too. Gordon Pike checked his watch impatiently. "Claire," he said carefully, "this gets worse the longer it drags out." Her fingers tightened around the pen. She could hear the restaurant beyond the office walls. Distant laughter, plates clinking, life continuing as if hers was already finished. Gordon leaned against the desk and lowered his voice. "You seem like a decent girl. I am trying to help you leave quietly." Leave quietly. The words settled heavily inside her chest. Funny how people always called humiliation kindness when they asked you not to defend yourself. Claire finally placed the pen down untouched. Gordon's expression darkened instantly. "What now?" She looked at him calmly. "I cannot sign something that is not true." "Then explain why that watch disappeared while you were standing there." Claire opened her mouth slightly, then stopped. "Because there was no explanation that would matter." Wealthy customers trusted expensive assumptions more than ordinary people. Gordon rubbed his forehead. "You know what your problem is?" Claire said nothing. "You act like this is happening to someone else." A faint smile almost touched her lips at that. Maybe because deep down, it did feel familiar. Like a scene she had already lived through once before. Gordon suddenly straightened as one of the security monitors caught his attention. Wait. He leaned closer to the screen showing the employee hallway behind the kitchen. A young busboy named Eric appeared beside Claire's locker nearly 20 minutes earlier. He glanced around nervously before disappearing from view. Gordon frowned harder. What the hell? Claire stepped closer quietly. The footage skipped slightly from the storm interference. Then Eric reappeared seconds later, moving quickly away from the lockers with his head lowered. Gordon's jaw tightened. That kid has been acting strange all week. Before Claire could answer, the office door opened abruptly. One of the servers hurried inside, breathing fast. Gordon, the guests are asking if the police are coming. Gordon cursed softly beneath his breath. Tell them we are handling it. The waitress hesitated awkwardly before adding. And Mr. Reed asked for the check. Something shifted in the room at the mention of Sebastian Reed leaving. Gordon looked suddenly anxious. No, absolutely not. He adjusted his tie quickly and rushed toward the dining room. Claire remained alone beside the desk for a moment, staring at the frozen security image of Eric near the lockers. Her stomach twisted slightly. Eric was 19 years old. Quiet. Nervous. Always trying too hard to please everyone. The kind of kid life cornered easily. Claire closed her eyes briefly. She knew exactly what desperation looked like. Out in the dining room, rain pounded harder against the tall windows while Sebastian Reed stood beside his table fastening the button of his charcoal coat. Conversations softened immediately around him. Power changed the temperature of every room it entered. Gordon hurried toward him with a polished smile that looked painfully forced. Mr. Reed, I sincerely apologize for tonight's inconvenience. Sebastian glanced once toward the office window where Claire still stood alone beneath cold fluorescent light. Did she sign it? Gordon hesitated. Not yet. Sebastian slid a black credit card onto the table beside his untouched whiskey glass. Interesting. Gordon forced a nervous laugh. We are still investigating. Sebastian's eyes remained fixed on Claire through the glass. No, he said quietly. You already decided she was guilty. Investigation would require patience. Gordon swallowed hard. Sir, with all respect, Bellamy's cannot risk protecting an employee during an accusation like this. Sebastian finally looked at him directly. Calm, sharp, controlled. And yet somehow, he said softly, she is the only person in this building who has not tried to protect herself. Gordon opened his mouth to respond when headlights suddenly swept across the restaurant windows from outside. Bright white beams cutting through rain and darkness. Several guests turned instinctively toward the entrance. Then came the sound. Tires gliding slowly over wet pavement before stopping directly outside Bellamy's Steakhouse. Sebastian looked toward the street as the reflection of a long black Bentley stretched across the rain-covered glass. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath as the black Bentley came to a smooth stop beneath the rain outside Bellamy's Steakhouse. Headlights reflected across the marble floor like pale rivers of light. Even the jazz music suddenly felt distant. Claire Bennett remained inside the office doorway while guests quietly turned toward the entrance. Gordon Pike straightened his jacket immediately, forcing confidence back into his posture. Probably another investor, he muttered under his breath, though his voice lacked certainty. Sebastian Reed said nothing. He simply watched the front doors while rain streamed down the tall windows behind him. The Bentley's driver stepped out first, holding a large black umbrella against the storm. Then the rear passenger door opened slowly. A woman in white gloves emerged carefully onto the sidewalk. Elegant, controlled, silver hair pinned neatly beneath the soft glow of the streetlights. The moment Sebastian saw her, his expression changed for the first time all evening. Mother, he said quietly. Gordon blinked in surprise. Mrs. Reed is here? Several employees immediately lowered their heads respectfully as Margaret Reed entered the restaurant carrying the kind of quiet presence money alone could never buy. She looked around calmly while water dripped softly from the edge of her umbrella. Then her eyes landed on Sebastian. You left your phone in the car again, she said gently while approaching his table. Her voice carried warmth beneath refinement. Sebastian accepted the phone with a faint nod. You drove through this storm for that. A mother does irrational things sometimes. A few nearby guests laughed softly, eager to impress her. But Margaret Reed barely noticed them. Her attention shifted instead toward the strange tension hanging across the dining room. She studied the broken coffee cup, still near table 12. The nervous employees. Gordon's rigid posture. Then finally, Claire standing silently behind the office glass. Margaret's expression changed slightly. What happened here? Gordon stepped forward quickly. Just a small misunderstanding, Mrs. Reed. We are handling everything professionally. Sebastian glanced once toward Gordon before speaking quietly. A guest accused one of the servers of stealing a watch. Margaret looked back toward Claire again. That girl. Yes. Something unreadable moved across Margaret's face as she slowly removed her gloves finger by finger. Then her eyes widened very slightly. A watch. Gordon forced another smile. Unfortunately, yes, ma'am. Very expensive. Margaret suddenly turned toward her driver near the entrance. Thomas. The older driver stepped forward immediately. Yes, Mrs. Reed. Bring me my handbag. Gordon frowned slightly, confused by the request. Claire remained perfectly still inside the office doorway, while Sebastian watched his mother carefully. He knew that expression. She was remembering something. Thomas returned seconds later carrying a dark leather handbag. Margaret opened it calmly while the entire restaurant watched in silence. Then she reached inside and removed a silver watch. The room froze instantly. Rain hammered against the windows. Somewhere near the bar, a wine glass slipped slightly against marble. Gordon's face drained of color. The customer from table 12 stepped forward in disbelief. That is my watch. Margaret looked genuinely surprised. Oh dear. She held the watch carefully beneath the chandelier light. This explains everything. Gordon swallowed hard. Mrs. Reed, where did you get that? Margaret's eyes moved immediately toward Claire. This young woman chased me outside nearly 40 minutes ago trying to return it. Silence crashed across the restaurant heavier than thunder. Claire lowered her eyes quietly. The customer stared at her in stunned confusion. What? Margaret nodded gently. I accidentally picked it up while reaching for my gloves earlier this evening. She noticed before anyone else did. Gordon looked physically sick now. But the watch box was found inside her locker. Sebastian's eyes sharpened immediately at those words. Margaret frowned softly. Then someone wanted her blamed very badly. Claire said nothing. Not one word. She simply stood there beneath the cold office light, while every person in the restaurant slowly realized what they had done to her. Sebastian looked at Claire differently now. Not like a waitress. Not like an employee caught in trouble. But like someone standing completely alone while an entire room chose the easier lie over the harder truth. No one moved for several seconds. The entire dining room sat frozen beneath the soft chandelier light, while rain whispered against the windows of Bellamy's Steakhouse. Claire Bennett still stood quietly inside the office doorway with her hands folded gently in front of her apron. Not triumphant, not angry, just tired. The customer from table 12 slowly reached for the silver watch in Margaret Reed's gloved hand, as if touching it might somehow undo the last hour. I do not understand, he murmured. Margaret looked toward Claire again with visible confusion. The young woman ran halfway into the rain, trying to return this to me. Her voice remained calm, but disappointment lingered beneath every word. She even apologized for interrupting my evening. Gordon Pike's face had gone pale beneath the restaurant lights. Tiny beads of sweat gathered near his collar despite the cold air conditioning. There must be some misunderstanding, he said quickly. The watch box was still found in her locker. Sebastian Reed turned slowly toward him. And yet the watch itself was never there. Gordon opened his mouth, but no words came out this time. Around the restaurant, whispers shifted direction completely. The same people who had stared suspiciously at Claire now avoided looking at her at all. Shame had entered the room quietly. Claire knew that feeling too. People rarely apologized once they realized they were wrong. They simply became uncomfortable around the truth. Margaret handed the watch back to its owner before walking calmly toward Claire. The older woman stopped directly in front of her, close enough to notice the faint coffee stain still darkening the edge of her apron. You were trying to help me, Margaret said softly. Claire lowered her eyes politely. I did not want you to lose something important. Margaret studied her face for a long moment. Then something flickered in her memory. A pause. Small but unmistakable. Have we met before? Claire's fingers tightened slightly together. I do not think so, ma'am. But Margaret continued staring. Somewhere deep behind her elegant composure, recognition slowly awakened. No, she whispered. I know those eyes. Sebastian looked between them carefully now. Claire's breathing became shallower almost instantly. Mrs. Reed, last winter, Margaret said suddenly. Outside St. Vincent's Hospital. The room fell silent again. Claire looked away first. That told Sebastian everything. Margaret's voice softened with disbelief. You are the young woman who helped me. Gordon frowned in confusion. Helped you? Margaret turned slowly toward the dining room. I collapsed outside the hospital during that snowstorm in January. Several guests exchanged surprised looks immediately. The story had made local news for days. Sebastian stepped closer now, concern replacing his usual calm distance. Mother, Margaret nodded gently. The paramedics told me someone stayed beside me nearly 20 minutes in freezing weather until help arrived. Her eyes returned to Claire. That was you. Claire swallowed quietly. Anyone would have done the same. Margaret smiled sadly. No, they would not. The restaurant remained perfectly still as pieces slowly came together in Sebastian's mind. The woman everyone had accused tonight had once saved his mother's life without ever mentioning it, without asking for recognition, without expecting reward. Gordon looked completely lost now. Claire, why did you never say anything? Claire finally looked up. Her expression stayed calm, but her eyes carried years of exhaustion inside them. Because people usually decide who you are before you speak. Those words settled heavily over the entire restaurant. Nobody argued with her. Nobody could. Sebastian glanced toward the office monitor, still frozen on the image of Eric standing near Claire's locker earlier that night. His jaw tightened subtly. Where is the busboy? Gordon blinked. Eric. Yes. Sebastian's voice remained controlled, but colder now. The one near her locker on the security footage. Gordon suddenly looked alarmed. He turned quickly toward the kitchen hallway. Empty. One of the servers hurried forward nervously. He left 20 minutes ago. Sebastian's eyes narrowed slightly while thunder rolled outside again. But Claire spoke before anyone else could. Please, she said quietly, do not ruin his life. Sebastian looked at her in disbelief. He framed you. Claire lowered her gaze again. Desperate people do foolish things when they are afraid. And somehow, that answer unsettled Sebastian Reed more than the betrayal itself. Rain continued sliding down the tall windows of Bellamy's steakhouse, while silence lingered over the dining room like smoke after a fire. Nobody seemed sure where to look anymore. Not at Claire Bennett. Not at Gordon Pike. Not even at Sebastian Reed, who still stood near table 12 with one hand resting against the back of a leather chair. Claire's words remained hanging in the air between them all. Desperate people do foolish things when they are afraid. The customer who had accused her lowered his eyes slowly toward the floor. His expensive watch now rested heavily around his wrist again, but somehow it no longer looked impressive. Just heavy. Miss Bennett, he said awkwardly. I owe you an apology. Claire offered a small polite nod. Nothing more. No satisfaction crossed her face. No bitterness either. That unsettled Sebastian almost as much as her silence earlier. Most people fought hard to be proven right. Claire seemed exhausted by the entire concept. Gordon finally cleared his throat nervously. Claire, perhaps we should discuss this privately. Sebastian looked at him sharply. You already did. Gordon swallowed hard beneath the weight of those words. Margaret Reed stepped closer to Claire and gently touched the stained sleeve of her uniform. You are freezing. Claire glanced down at the coffee stains still drying against the fabric. She had almost forgotten about them. I am all right. Margaret smiled sadly. People who say that usually are not. The older woman slowly removed her white gloves again, revealing elegant fingers marked softly by age. You stayed beside me in the snow for nearly 20 minutes last winter while strangers walked past pretending not to notice. Several guests looked visibly uncomfortable hearing that. Margaret continued quietly. When the ambulance arrived, you disappeared before they could even ask your name. Claire shifted slightly. You needed help. That was enough. Sebastian studied her carefully now. The more she spoke, the less he understood her. Manhattan was filled with people who attached price tags to kindness. Investors, politicians, executives. Everyone wanted something in return eventually. But Claire Bennett stood in front of public humiliation, false accusations, and possible arrest without once mentioning that she had once saved his mother's life. She could have ended the entire situation instantly. Instead, she stayed silent. Why? Sebastian finally asked the question aloud. Why did you not say who you were? Claire looked genuinely confused. Who I was? My mother recognized you immediately. Claire lowered her eyes toward the marble floor. It did not feel important. Gordon let out a disbelieving breath. Not important? Claire, you could have defended yourself. She looked at him calmly. People hear status faster than truth. Nobody answered that. Because deep down, everyone in the room knew she was right. Sebastian glanced toward the office monitor again, frozen on Eric's nervous face beside the lockers. The police should still be notified, Gordon muttered weakly. Claire turned immediately toward him. Please do not. Sebastian frowned. You still want to protect him? Claire hesitated for the first time all night. Eric works 2 jobs. Gordon blinked in surprise. Claire continued softly. His mother is sick. Last month he slept in the subway for 3 nights because he could not pay rent. The room became quiet again. Claire wrapped her fingers gently around the edge of her wet apron. Fear changes people. Sebastian looked at her differently now. Not with curiosity anymore. With something heavier. Respect. The dangerous kind that sneaks up quietly. Margaret noticed it instantly in her son's eyes and almost smiled. Then suddenly, Gordon's phone vibrated loudly against the table. He glanced down at the screen, and his expression collapsed completely. Oh no. Sebastian's voice sharpened. What? Gordon looked physically ill now. The owners just saw the security report. Another message appeared instantly afterward. Then another. Gordon read them silently, while color drained from his face. Finally, he looked toward Claire with visible shame. They want me suspended immediately pending investigation. Nobody reacted. Not even Claire. Gordon stared at her for several painful seconds before speaking again, quieter this time. You warned me once, did not you? Claire's eyes softened slightly. Earlier that evening, before the accusation started, she had gently told him the staff security cameras near the lockers had been malfunctioning all week. Gordon had ignored her. Too busy. Too confident. Too certain he already understood everything. Now the consequences stood all around him beneath chandelier light and falling rain. Claire slowly removed her employee name tag from her apron and placed it carefully on the nearest table. The tiny metal click echoed softly in the silence. Sebastian's eyes narrowed slightly. What are you doing? Claire looked toward the rain outside. Going home. The rain outside had softened into a slow silver drizzle by the time Claire Bennett stepped away from the table and toward the employee hallway. Her black shoes moved quietly across the marble floor while every eye in Bellamy's Steakhouse followed her. Nobody stopped her at first. Nobody seemed to know how. Shame had changed the atmosphere completely. Earlier that evening, people looked at Claire like a suspect. Now they looked at her like a mirror reflecting something uncomfortable back at them. Gordon Pike remained frozen beside the office doorway, staring at the small employee name tag she had left behind on the table. Claire Bennett. Such ordinary words for someone who had just exposed how fragile everyone's assumptions really were. Claire. Sebastian Reed's voice stopped her gently before she reached the hallway. She paused, but did not turn around immediately. The restaurant stayed silent. Even the servers near the kitchen pretended not to breathe too loudly. Sebastian walked toward her slowly, his polished shoes barely making sound against the floor. Up close, Claire noticed faint exhaustion beneath his calm expression now. The kind wealthy people tried hard to hide behind tailored suits and expensive watches. You are leaving? He asked quietly. Claire finally turned toward him. I think tonight has already lasted long enough. Sebastian glanced toward the folded resignation form still sitting and signed inside Gordon's office. You did nothing wrong. Claire gave a faint, tired smile. That has never guaranteed much. Those words landed harder than Sebastian expected. Margaret Reed watched silently nearby, studying both of them with knowing eyes. Sebastian looked at Claire for several seconds before speaking again. Bellamy should apologize publicly. Claire shook her head gently. Public humiliation does not become justice just because the direction changes. Gordon lowered his eyes immediately after hearing that. The older customer from table 12 stepped forward awkwardly, still clutching his silver watch. Miss Bennett, I truly am sorry. Claire nodded politely. I know. If there is anything I can do, there is. The man looked relieved for a moment. Then Claire continued softly. The next time someone poor looks nervous around expensive people, maybe do not assume the worst so quickly. The man's face flushed with quiet embarrassment. Claire did not wait for a response. She turned again toward the hallway, disappearing briefly into the employee locker room while thunder rolled softly far above Manhattan. Inside the small room, fluorescent lights flickered weakly above metal lockers scratched by years of use. Claire removed the stained apron slowly and folded it with careful hands. Habit. Respect for things you could not afford to replace. Her locker contained almost nothing. A gray sweater, a paperback novel with folded corners, and an overdue electric bill tucked beneath a bottle of aspirin. She slipped on the sweater and closed the locker gently. For a moment, she simply stood there listening to the muffled sounds of the restaurant beyond the wall. Strange how quickly places stop belonging to you. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Claire turned slightly as Margaret Reed stepped quietly into the locker room, elegant even beneath fluorescent lighting. "I hope I am not intruding." Claire shook her head. "No, ma'am." Margaret looked around the cramped room slowly before her eyes settled on Claire again. "You saved my life last winter." Claire looked uncomfortable hearing the words spoken aloud. "The paramedics saved you." Margaret smiled softly. "No, they arrived because you stayed." Silence settled gently between them. Then Margaret reached into her handbag and removed a folded business card. "My son rarely notices people," she said carefully. "Tonight he noticed you." Claire accepted the card politely without looking at it. "I am not searching for favors." Margaret's expression warmed slightly. "That is exactly why he will remember you." Before Claire could answer, voices suddenly echoed from the restaurant hallway outside. Loud, nervous. Then came hurried footsteps. Gordon appeared breathless at the locker room entrance. "Claire." Eric came back. Claire's eyes widened slightly. "What?" Gordon swallowed hard. "He is in the dining room." Sebastian's voice carried faintly from beyond the hallway. Calm, controlled. "Let him speak." Claire closed her eyes for one brief second. Because deep down, she already knew exactly what fear looked like when it finally ran out of places to hide. The dining room had grown unnaturally quiet by the time Claire Bennett stepped back through the hallway beside Margaret Reed and Gordon Pike. Rain still shimmered faintly across the windows, but the storm outside no longer felt as heavy as the one inside Bellamy's steakhouse. Near the entrance stood Eric. His soaked hoodie clung to his shoulders while water dripped steadily onto the marble floor beneath him. He looked smaller somehow than he had earlier that evening. Younger too. 19 years old, and already carrying the exhausted posture of someone who had spent too long apologizing for existing. Several guests stared openly at him now, the same way they had stared at Claire before the truth arrived. Eric could barely lift his eyes from the floor. Sebastian Reed stood near table 12 with his hands loosely folded in front of him. Calm, silent, waiting. Gordon stepped forward first. "Eric," he said sharply, "where did you go?" Eric swallowed hard. I panicked." Gordon's voice rose instantly. "You planted that watch box in Claire's locker?" Eric flinched at the accusation, even though nobody touched him. "I did not steal the watch." "That is not what I asked." Claire quietly stepped closer before Gordon could continue. "Let him breathe." Gordon stared at her in disbelief. "Claire, after what he did to you." Eric finally looked up then, his eyes red from rain and shame. "I am sorry," he whispered. "I never thought it would go this far." The restaurant remained silent enough to hear ice settling inside abandoned glasses. Sebastian studied the young man carefully. Fear always revealed itself differently. Some people became angry, others cruel. Eric looked broken long before tonight even started. "Why did you do it?" Sebastian asked quietly. Eric's throat moved as he struggled to answer. "Because they told me I was getting fired next week." Gordon frowned. "Who told you that?" "The kitchen staff." Eric wiped rainwater nervously from his face. "They said Bellamy's was cutting employees after the Reed Holdings deal." Sebastian's expression hardened slightly. "That decision was never approved." Eric let out a shaky breath. "My mom needs dialysis 3 times a week." His voice cracked softly now. "I could not lose this job." Nobody interrupted him. Not even Gordon anymore. Eric stared helplessly toward Claire. "I saw the watch box near the office after Mrs. Reed left. I just thought if something went missing, management would blame the new girl first." Those words hit the room like cold wind. Because everyone knew he had been right. Claire lowered her eyes quietly. Not offended, just sad. Eric's breathing became uneven. "I was going to take the box back after the shift ended. But then everyone started talking about police, and I got scared." Gordon rubbed both hands over his face slowly. "Jesus Christ." Sebastian glanced briefly toward Claire. She remained perfectly still while the boy who framed her practically collapsed under the weight of his own guilt. Most people would have demanded punishment by now. Public revenge. Satisfaction. But Claire looked at Eric the same way she looked at everyone tonight. Like she could somehow see the pain underneath their mistakes. Margaret Reed noticed it too. "You came back," she said gently to Eric. The boy nodded weakly. Because she defended me. His voice trembled now. Even after everything. Claire looked uncomfortable hearing that spoken aloud. Eric turned toward her completely. Why would you do that? The question hung softly in the restaurant air. Claire took a long breath before answering. Because once people decide you are guilty, they stop seeing you as human. Silence spread again. Heavy. Honest. Gordon slowly sat down at the nearest empty table, like his legs no longer trusted him. Sebastian's eyes remained fixed on Claire, while something inside him shifted quietly into place. Wolf had taught him how to measure intelligence, influence, ambition. But standing here tonight, watching Claire Bennett protect the very person who humiliated her publicly, Sebastian realized there was another kind of strength entirely. The kind that did not need witnesses to exist. Eric suddenly reached into his hoodie pocket with shaking hands and removed a folded envelope. There is one more thing, he whispered. Gordon frowned. What is that? Eric stared toward Claire before answering softly. Someone paid me to put the box in her locker. The restaurant seemed to shrink around Eric as he stood trembling beneath the chandelier light with the folded envelope clutched tightly in his wet hands. Nobody spoke. Rain tapped softly against the windows while every face in Bellamy's steakhouse turned toward him again. Claire Bennett remained still near the hallway entrance, her gray sweater replacing the stained waitress apron now folded quietly inside her locker. Sebastian Reed watched Eric carefully, his expression unreadable. What do you mean someone paid you? Gordon Pike asked slowly. Eric swallowed hard before stepping forward. 3 nights ago, somebody approached me outside the subway station after work. His voice shook slightly. He knew about my mother. About the hospital bills. Margaret Reed frowned gently. Did you know him? Eric shook his head immediately. No, ma'am. He wore a dark coat and baseball cap. I never saw his face clearly. Gordon rubbed his temples in frustration. And this stranger just handed you money? Eric lowered his eyes. $5,000. Several guests exchanged shocked looks instantly. For someone dining inside Bellamy's, $5,000 sounded inconvenient. For Eric, it sounded like survival. Sebastian noticed Claire watching Eric with quiet sadness instead of judgment again. That bothered him in ways he could not fully explain. Eric slowly held up the envelope. He said if a theft happened during tonight's Reed Holdings dinner, management would panic and blame whoever looked weakest. Gordon looked physically ill hearing the words spoken aloud. And you believed him? Eric laughed softly then. Not because anything was funny. Because hopeless people sometimes laughed when shame became too heavy to carry silently. People like me do not get many choices. Sebastian stepped closer now. What exactly were you told to do? Eric carefully opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside sat a stack of $100 bills and a folded note written in clean black ink. Eric handed the note toward Sebastian. The room stayed completely silent while Sebastian unfolded it slowly beneath the soft restaurant lighting. One sentence. Short. Precise. Plant the box in the new waitress locker after 10 o'clock. Sebastian's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Gordon stared at the note in disbelief. Who would do this? Claire looked down quietly, as if she already knew the answer mattered less than people wanted it to. Margaret Reed noticed her expression immediately. Claire hesitated before speaking softly. Earlier this week, I overheard 2 managers discussing layoffs after the Reed Holdings partnership. Gordon looked confused. What does that have to do with tonight? Claire lifted her eyes slowly. One of them blamed me for the staffing complaints. Sebastian frowned. Complaints. Gordon suddenly looked uncomfortable. Claire continued calmly. Some employees were upset that customers requested my section more often. A silence followed those words. Not because anyone doubted her. Because everyone suddenly understood. Bellamy's Steakhouse thrived on appearance. Beautiful lighting. Expensive wine. Attractive servers who smiled at wealthy guests. Claire's quiet professionalism had made her popular with customers quickly. Popular enough to threaten people who depended on attention to survive. Gordon let out a slow breath. Denise. Claire did not answer. She did not need to. Gordon shook his head in disbelief. Assistant floor manager Denise Harper has hated every staffing change since you arrived. Sebastian glanced toward the office hallway sharply. Where is she now? One of the servers spoke nervously from near the bar. She left right before Mrs. Reed arrived. Gordon cursed softly beneath his breath. Sebastian folded the note carefully between his fingers while rain shimmered beyond the windows behind him. Get security footage from outside immediately. Gordon nodded and hurried toward the office. Eric looked toward Claire helplessly. I never wanted you hurt. Claire's eyes softened slightly. I know. Eric blinked in confusion. How? Claire gave the faintest tired smile. Because guilty people usually protect themselves first. Those words settled heavily over the room. Eric lowered his head instantly, ashamed because she had understood him better than he understood himself. Sebastian stared at Claire quietly, while something unfamiliar moved beneath his calm exterior. Respect had become admiration somewhere during the last hour. Dangerous admiration. The kind built not from charm or beauty, but from witnessing someone remain kind in a moment that gave them every reason not to be. Then suddenly Gordon's voice echoed sharply from the office. Sebastian, you need to see this. The office lights cast a cold glow across Gordon Pike's face as Sebastian Reed stepped beside him to look at the security monitor. Rain blurred the outside cameras slightly, turning the Manhattan sidewalk into streaks of silver and black. Gordon pressed pause with trembling fingers. There, he whispered. On the screen, Denise Harper stood near the alley entrance behind Bellamy's Steakhouse just after 9:30 that evening. She wore a long beige coat and held an umbrella low over her face. A tall man approached briefly from the shadows near the service entrance. The footage had no audio, but the exchange was clear enough. An envelope passed from one hand to the other. Then Denise looked around nervously before slipping it into her purse. Sebastian's eyes narrowed slightly. Zoom in. Gordon enlarged the image carefully. The man's face remained hidden beneath the rain and baseball cap, but the envelope matched the one Eric carried moments earlier almost exactly. Claire stood quietly behind them, watching the footage without surprise. Margaret Reed noticed immediately. You suspected this already. Claire lowered her eyes softly. I suspected someone wanted me gone before tonight even started. Gordon turned toward her in disbelief. Why did you not tell me? Claire gave a tired smile that carried no joy inside it. Would you have believed me? Gordon opened his mouth, then stopped. Because they both already knew the answer. Outside the office, guests remained seated in uneasy silence, while servers whispered nervously near the kitchen. Bellamy's Steakhouse no longer felt luxurious tonight. Just exposed. Gordon rubbed his forehead slowly. Denise has worked here 8 years. Sebastian kept his attention on the paused footage. And she nearly destroyed an innocent person because she felt threatened. Margaret's expression darkened slightly. Fear mixed with jealousy becomes cruelty very quickly. Eric stood near the doorway, still soaked from rain and shame. She told me nobody would care about Claire anyway. His voice cracked softly. She said people always protect management over waitresses. Claire looked away quietly after hearing that. Not because the words hurt, because they sounded familiar. Sebastian noticed her reaction immediately. This has happened to you before. Claire hesitated. The office became still again. At my last restaurant, she admitted softly. A manager blamed missing cash on me during inventory season. Gordon frowned. Were you clear? Claire laughed quietly then. A small sound without happiness in it. No. They found the money later after I already lost the job. Sebastian stared at her carefully now. And nobody apologized? Claire shook her head once. People become uncomfortable around mistakes they cannot undo. The words settled heavily in the office air. Gordon slowly sat down in the chair beside the monitor like the weight of the evening had finally reached him. Claire, he looked genuinely ashamed now. I treated you horribly tonight. Claire remained calm. You were afraid too. Gordon blinked in confusion. Afraid? Claire nodded gently toward the restaurant beyond the office glass. You thought if Reed Holdings walked away from the partnership, everyone here might lose their jobs. Gordon lowered his eyes immediately because she was right again. Sebastian leaned silently against the desk, studying Claire with growing disbelief. She saw through people too easily, not in a manipulative way, in a painful one, like someone who had spent years learning how fear changed human beings. Margaret looked toward her son quietly and recognized the exact moment something shifted permanently inside him. Then suddenly the front doors opened again. Cold air swept briefly through the restaurant as Denise Harper stepped back inside, carrying her purse tightly against her chest. She froze the moment she saw everyone staring at her. Rainwater dripped from the edge of her coat onto the marble floor. Gordon stood immediately. Denise. Her eyes darted around the room nervously before landing on Claire near the office doorway. Then she noticed the security footage paused on the monitor behind Gordon. Color drained slowly from her face. "What is this?" she whispered. Nobody answered right away. Sebastian stepped forward calmly. "I think," he said quietly, "you already know." Denise's breathing became uneven. "You cannot prove anything." Gordon pointed silently toward the monitor. Denise looked at the frozen image of herself accepting the envelope outside in the rain. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Denise looked directly at Claire for the first time all night. And instead of anger, what appeared in her eyes was something far more dangerous. Regret. Denise Harper stood motionless beneath the chandelier light, while rainwater dripped slowly from the edge of her beige coat onto the polished marble floor. The security image frozen on Gordon Pike's monitor reflected faintly in her eyes now. She looked less like a manager and more like someone suddenly cornered by her own choices. Nobody rushed toward her. Nobody shouted. Somehow the silence felt heavier than anger would have. Claire Bennett remained near the office doorway with both hands folded calmly in front of her gray sweater. Even now, after everything, she looked at Denise without hatred. That unsettled Sebastian Reed more than anything else tonight. Denise let out a shaky breath before finally speaking. "I never thought it would become this big." Gordon stared at her in disbelief. "You framed an innocent employee." Denise's eyes filled instantly with tears she seemed embarrassed to show. "You do not understand." "Then explain it," Sebastian said quietly. His voice never rose. It did not need to. Denise looked toward him nervously before lowering her eyes again. Bellamy's was changing after Claire arrived. Claire shifted slightly. "Denise." No, Denise shook her head weakly. "You deserve to hear this." The restaurant remained completely still while she struggled to steady her breathing. "Customers requested your section constantly. The owners noticed." Gordon noticed. Gordon looked ashamed immediately. Denise continued softly. "For 8 years I worked double shifts here. Holidays. Weekends. Every storm Manhattan ever had." Her voice cracked. Then suddenly one quiet waitress walks in, and everybody starts acting like she is special. Claire's expression softened with sadness instead of triumph. Denise laughed bitterly beneath her breath. "Do you know what scared me the most?" Nobody answered. Denise looked directly at Claire for the first time all evening. "You never competed with anyone." The words hung strangely in the air. "You never flirted for tips. Never gossiped. Never tried to impress customers." Denise wiped quickly at her eyes. "People just trusted you naturally. And I hated how easy that looked." Gordon lowered himself slowly into a chair near the office like his legs no longer trusted him. Margaret Reed watched Denise quietly with the same expression she once reserved for broken things people handled carelessly. Denise reached into her purse with trembling fingers and removed another envelope. "The man outside the restaurant offered me $20,000 if I made sure Claire got blamed publicly tonight." Sebastian's expression darkened slightly. "Did he give a name?" Denise shook her head. "No, but he knew about the Reed Holdings contract dinner weeks before it became public." Sebastian exchanged a quick glance with Gordon. Someone connected to the business deal itself. Someone who wanted chaos inside Bellamy's tonight. Claire noticed the shift immediately. "This was never really about me." Sebastian looked toward her carefully. "No, you were simply the easiest target." The honesty in his voice made Gordon close his eyes briefly. Denise suddenly turned fully toward Claire now, tears slipping down her face without restraint anymore. "I am sorry." Claire remained silent for a moment. Rain tapped softly against the windows while expensive guests sat frozen around half-finished dinners and untouched wine glasses. Finally, Claire spoke quietly. "I believe you." Denise blinked in confusion. "After everything?" Claire nodded once. "Fear makes people selfish. But regret means part of you still knows right from wrong." Denise covered her mouth suddenly, as if those words hurt more than punishment ever could. Sebastian watched Claire carefully again, while something inside him shifted deeper than admiration now. Respect could be earned in business. Intelligence could be measured. But grace under humiliation? Compassion after betrayal? Those things could not be taught in boardrooms or bought with money. Gordon stood slowly from his chair and looked toward Denise. "The owners will still need statements from everyone involved." Denise nodded weakly. "I know." Then her eyes drifted back toward Claire again. "Why are you being kind to me?" Claire looked toward the rain outside before answering softly. "Because someone once showed me kindness on the worst day of my life." Sebastian noticed the way her voice changed slightly when she said those words. Quieter, older somehow, like the memory still carried weight inside her. Before he could ask what she meant, Gordon's office phone rang sharply through the silence. Everyone turned instinctively toward the desk. Gordon picked up slowly, listened for several seconds, then looked toward Sebastian with visible shock. "It is Reed Holdings Security." Gordon swallowed hard. They found the man from the alley. The office phone remained pressed against Gordon Pike's ear while the entire restaurant waited in absolute silence. Rain shimmered across the tall windows behind him, turning the Manhattan streets outside into blurred rivers of light. Gordon listened for several more seconds before slowly lowering the receiver. His face looked pale beneath the fluorescent office glow. Sebastian Reed stepped closer immediately. Who was he? Gordon swallowed once before answering. Reed Holdings Security identified him from nearby traffic cameras. He looked directly at Sebastian now. "His name is Daniel Mercer." Sebastian's expression hardened almost invisibly. Margaret Reed recognized the name first. "Mercer Capital?" Gordon nodded slowly. A murmur moved through several guests seated nearby. Even Claire Bennett understood enough from their reactions to know the name carried weight. Mercer Capital was one of Reed Holdings' biggest competitors in Manhattan real estate acquisitions. Sebastian stared toward the rain-covered windows for a long moment. "Daniel Mercer attended the charity gala last month," he said quietly. He knew the Bellamy's partnership dinner was happening tonight. Gordon rubbed his forehead again. Security believes the plan was never about the watch itself. Claire spoke softly from near the office doorway. It was about embarrassing Reed Holdings publicly. Sebastian looked toward her immediately. If police arrived tonight during contract negotiations, investors would panic. Gordon nodded weakly. The footage alone could have damaged tomorrow's press coverage. Denise Harper lowered herself slowly into a nearby chair, visibly shaken now by how much larger the situation had become. "I thought it was just about getting rid of Claire." Her voice trembled softly. "I never knew. Mercer used your jealousy because it made you easy to manipulate," Margaret Reed said gently. Denise covered her face briefly with both hands. Eric stood motionless nearby, guilt still hanging heavily over his exhausted expression. Sebastian remained silent for several seconds while pieces connected carefully inside his mind. A competitor needed chaos. Denise needed someone to blame. Eric needed money. And Claire. Claire had simply been the person least likely to fight back loudly enough for anyone to notice. The realization sat heavily in his chest. Claire noticed him staring and quietly looked away first. Sebastian stepped toward her slowly. "You understood all of this before the rest of us did not you?" Claire hesitated. "Not everything." "Enough." She looked toward the marble floor briefly before answering. "People with power rarely attack directly." Gordon frowned slightly. Claire continued softly. "They usually look for someone invisible enough to carry the damage for them." Nobody interrupted her because tonight had proven she was right. Sebastian glanced again toward the folded resignation papers still resting untouched inside Gordon's office. Claire had been ready to sacrifice herself quietly because experience taught her that truth alone was often too weak to survive against fear, money, and assumptions. Something about that realization unsettled him deeply. Margaret watched her son carefully now. She had seen that look before. Years ago, before wealth hardened him into caution and distance. Back when he still believed integrity mattered more than leverage. Gordon finally looked toward Claire fully. "The owners want to issue a formal statement tomorrow clearing your name publicly." Claire shook her head gently almost immediately. "That is not necessary." Gordon blinked. "Claire, after tonight? Public attention fades quickly." She offered a small tired smile. "I would rather move on quietly." Sebastian stared at her in disbelief again. "You are walking away from this without demanding anything." Claire looked genuinely confused by the question. What would demanding things change? Sebastian had no answer ready for that. Because in his world, everyone demanded something eventually. Money, influence, opportunity, revenge. Yet Claire Bennett stood in the middle of humiliation, betrayal, and public accusation without asking for compensation once. Margaret stepped closer to her softly. "You remind me of someone I used to know." Claire smiled faintly. "Someone kind." Margaret shook her head slowly. "Someone strong enough to stay kind after life gave them reasons not to." Silence settled warmly this time instead of painfully. Outside, the rain finally began to ease. Gordon suddenly looked toward Sebastian again. The Reed Holdings board still expects your decision about the Bellamy's partnership tonight. Several employees tensed immediately after hearing that. Jobs, rent, families. Everything suddenly depended on what Sebastian Reed decided next. Sebastian glanced around the restaurant slowly. At Gordon, at Denise, at frightened young Eric. Then finally at Claire Bennett, standing quietly near the doorway like she still expected none of this to matter tomorrow. Sebastian took a long breath before speaking calmly. Bellamy's does not need better branding. His eyes remained fixed on Claire now. It needs better people. The rain had almost completely stopped by the time the last guests began quietly leaving Bellamy's steakhouse. Manhattan shimmered outside beneath wet streetlights and passing headlights, the city glowing softly like it had finally exhaled after holding its breath all night. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere felt different now. Smaller somehow. More honest. Gordon Pike stood near the entrance speaking quietly with the remaining staff, while Denise Harper signed formal statements beside the office. Eric sat at a corner booth with a cup of untouched coffee in front of him, staring silently at his folded hands like he was trying to understand the kind of person he still wanted to become. Claire Bennett moved slowly through the dining room collecting abandoned glasses from empty tables. Not because anyone asked her to. Habit. Dignity. Some people cleaned rooms because they were paid to. Claire cleaned them because she believed leaving quietly mattered. Sebastian Reed watched her from across the restaurant for several moments before finally approaching. "You do realize," he said softly. "You are technically off the clock." Claire placed another wine glass carefully onto her tray. "The night staff already had enough chaos because of me." Sebastian shook his head slightly. "None of this was because of you." Claire looked toward the rain-streaked windows instead of answering. Somewhere outside, a taxi horn echoed faintly through the wet Manhattan streets. Sebastian studied her profile beneath the warm chandelier light. "The board approved the Bellamy's partnership 30 minutes ago." Claire nodded politely. "That is good news. It came with conditions." She looked at him then. Calm. Curious. Sebastian glanced briefly toward Gordon across the room. "Mandatory ethics restructuring. Employee protection policies. Anonymous reporting systems." Claire blinked softly, surprised. Sebastian's expression remained composed, but gentler now. Nobody working here should ever feel invisible again. Silence settled warmly between them. Claire looked down at the tray in her hands. "You are changing an entire company because one waitress had a bad night." "No," Sebastian's voice lowered slightly. "Because one waitress reminded me what leadership is supposed to look like." Claire seemed uncomfortable hearing praise directed toward her again. Margaret Reed appeared quietly nearby, wearing her white gloves once more, elegant even near closing time. "Your driver is waiting, Sebastian." He nodded faintly without looking away from Claire. Margaret smiled softly toward Claire before speaking. "I hope this city becomes kinder to you." Claire returned the smile gently. "Cities do not become kind, Mrs. Reed. People do." Margaret's eyes warmed instantly at that answer. She touched Claire's hand briefly before walking toward the entrance beneath the glow of the restaurant lights. Sebastian remained standing beside Claire after his mother left. Neither spoke for several seconds. Somehow the silence no longer felt uncomfortable. Finally, Sebastian reached into his coat pocket and carefully placed a business card on the table beside her tray. Black lettering. Minimal design. Reed Holdings. Claire looked at it, but did not pick it up immediately. "What is this? An offer?" Sebastian's tone stayed calm. "Not charity. Not repayment." His eyes met hers fully. "I think someone with your instincts understands people better than most executives I know." Claire almost laughed softly at that. "I am a waitress." Sebastian shook his head once. "No. You are someone who stayed kind in a room that gave you every reason not to be." Claire looked down at the business card for a long moment, while soft jazz drifted quietly through the nearly empty restaurant. Then she slid the card gently into the pocket of her gray sweater. Not acceptance. Not rejection. Just possibility. Outside, the rain had finally stopped completely. Sebastian walked toward the entrance before pausing beside the glass doors one last time. He turned slightly toward Claire. "For what it is worth," he said quietly, "you were the strongest person in this building tonight." Claire stood alone beneath the warm chandelier light, holding an empty tray against her chest while the city shimmered peacefully outside. For the first time all evening, she smiled without sadness in it. Small, quiet, real. And somewhere beyond the windows of Bellamy's Steakhouse, Manhattan kept moving beneath the midnight sky, unaware that inside one restaurant, the truth had arrived late. But it had arrived all the same. Sometimes the loudest thing a person can do is remain gentle after the world gives them every reason not to be. And if this story meant something to you tonight, perhaps leave a quiet thought below, because the people who stay kind in difficult moments are often carrying battles nobody else can see. And sometimes, hearing that their strength mattered can change more than we realize.